Epilogue. Yates used to ruminate gloomily about the kind of obituary he'd get. 2 inches in the Times, he'd say, at best, and the only book they'll mention is Revolutionary Road. One likes to think he would have been pleased that he was at least somewhat mistaken, since in fact the Times's lead obituary for Monday, November 9th, was Yates's. And while it's true that his first and most famous novel was the only one discussed at length, the other titles were duly listed and collectively described as being about self-deception, disappointment, and grief. The rest of his career was limbed from Yonkers to Avon to the Army to Remington Rand, from speechwriting to teaching and 2 broken marriages. Sam Lawrence got in a plug for uncertain times, though he added that he wasn't sure yet whether the manuscript was in publishable form. Yates was dubbed in the headline a chronicler of disappointed lives. Fair enough. Monica was the first to be notified of her father's death, and for a long time she felt complete desolation and brokenheartedness. I didn't know how I was going to keep going without him. Who else would respond to me like that? No one else would really see me the way he did. And I think I was so interesting and get what I was saying when I said it. Monica had become so attached to her father that as his health failed, she begged him to reassure her that some sort of afterlife existed so they could be reunited. But Yates wasn't having any of that. Nah, baby, he'd say, just blackness. Gina was still in Mexico when her father died. She called him that Sunday as usual, hoping he'd already be home after his routine procedure. Fearing the worst when he didn't answer, she called her mother, who'd just gotten the news from Sharon. Gina burst into tears, Martha recalled, destroyed. Outside the family, the person who probably took Yates's death the hardest was Andre D., who seemed not only devastated but angry when he called his first wife Pat. Dick let himself die, he sobbed. 2 weeks later, Monica and Sharon went to Tuscaloosa to pack up their father's things and decide what to do about the body, which was being kept in cold storage at a local funeral home. There were a few complications. Yates was entitled to a free burial at the VA cemetery in Alabama, but his daughters agreed he wouldn't have liked that, so they arranged to pay for cremation. At the last moment, though, the funeral home director discovered that a third daughter existed in Mexico and refused to proceed without her signature. Monica and Sharon joked about stowing the body in Yates's old Mazda and shipping it home, but as it happened, there was no extra charge for a few more weeks of refrigeration. Meanwhile, they had to clear out the bungalow on Alaca Place. Ellen Weir and some graduate students had already cleaned up the worst of it, including the loose change strewn about the floor, which they'd left for the daughters in a tidy plastic bag. Yates's remaining effects were as follows: an air conditioner and typewriter, which were stashed in the Mazda and trucked back to Brooklyn, some books and unpacked boxes of letters. I should throw this shit out, Yates had said in May, his life's store of letters, but Monica talked him out of it. A spavined old sofa, table, and bed. Some soiled sheets in the back of the closet, which Yates had lacked the energy to clean. The books and letters were mailed home, the rest abandoned. On the plane back to New York, Monica and Sharon sat putting the loose change into rolls. Our inheritance, they laughed, the family fortune. On December 16, 1992, Sam Lawrence and Kurt Vonnegut hosted a memorial service for Yates at the Century Club in Manhattan. In his eulogy, Vonnegut spoke of the forced march he'd made through all 9 of Yates's books before preparing his remarks. Not only did I fail to detect so much as an injudiciously applied semicolon, I did not find even one paragraph which, if it were read to you today, would not wow you with its power, intelligence, and clarity. He remembered how his old friend Yates had always yearned to live as F. Scott Fitzgerald lived when Fitzgerald was rich and famous and young, to jump into the plaza fountain with his clothes on and his pockets stuffed with paper money. But even though Yates was a more careful writer than Fitzgerald, and one who was even more cunningly observant, he could never escape the middle-class life he wrote about so well. Finally, Vonnegut looked back on the early days of their friendship at the writer's workshop in Iowa City. One of our colleagues was Nelson Algren, he concluded, another world-class storyteller and outsider who died broke, but who was more famous than Yates because he had made love to Simone de Beauvoir. These things matter. Vonnegut read tributes by Dee and Laurie Rackstraw, and then a number of illustrious people, Yates's good if not close friends, read from his work. Styron, Frank Conroy, Barrett Prettyman, David Milch, Dan Wakefield, and Robert Stone. Richard Price and Richard Levine gave reminiscences, as did Yates's short-lived girlfriend from the mid-70s, Carolyn Gazer, who startled the crowd, "Who is that?" with a wittily impious evocation of Yates as essentially a lonely alcoholic given to monumental tantrums. The last item on the program was a long requiem by Sam Lawrence, read by his son Nick because of the former's stammer. Among other things, Lawrence remembered his boozy Harvard Club dinners with Yates in their youth, and dwelled at curious length on facts and figures relating to their various contracts. All in all, though, it was a fair and heartfelt summation of Yates's career. He drank too much, he smoked too much, he was accident-prone, he led an itinerant life, but as a writer he was all in place, said Lawrence. He wrote the best dialogue since John O'Hara, who also lacked the so-called advantages of Harvard and Yale. And like O'Hara, he was a master of realism, totally attuned to the nuances of American behavior and speech. Lawrence ended, "You know what I think he would have said to all this? Come on, Sam, knock it off. Let's have a drink." And so they did. While a jazz pianist played the standards Yates had loved so well, an odd assortment of long-lost friends and family ate, drank, and caught up. Yates's nephews, Peter and Fred Rogers, were there, as was his niece, Ruth, Dodo, who spoke bitterly about her alcoholic mother, Grace Schulman. Shit, I already fucked up. Who spoke bitterly about her alcoholic mother. Grace Schulman was there, not an alcoholic that I know of. At one point, guests had been asked to stand and share memories of Yates, and she mentioned the advice given to her as an apprentice poet. "Write with balls, Grace," as well as the way he'd insisted on fining her and Jerry a dime for saying unkind words about absent people. Wendy Sears was there and read aloud the letter that lonely Yates had written from Hollywood in 1965, all about how cheered he'd been by a Father's Day poem from the 8-year-old Monica. Bob Reich was there, despite having written a 1990 novel whose protagonist, Bill Brock, named after Reich's oafish persona in Young Hearts Crying, reflects thus on his old friend, Pritch Bates. He managed to squeeze out a half-dozen largely ignored lifeless novels in which, with increasing bitterness, he blamed his mother, his father, his sister, his ex-wives, and whatever former friends he once had for the miserable mess he has since made of his life. Footnote, he sent the novel, What Are We Doing in Latin America?, for old time's sake to Yates, who replied graciously, "Reading about Pritchard Bates did inflict an acute little cut, but it was mercifully brief and therefore hardly comparable to my own more extended and clumsy swiping at Bill Brock in a failed '84 novel that I'll always regret having written." Yates sent a glowing blurb to the publisher in behalf of Reich's book. And Bob Parker was there, though he was a bit unsettled to learn that Monica, "I'm surprised to see you," was bitterly aware of his 1985 lampoon, A Clef. "So big deal, Bob Parker," she wrote him afterward. "You had a few asshole qualities, and Dad focused on those and brought them to life, i.e. in Young Hearts Crying. I hope in the end you see the compliment he paid you, deeming you artist enough to face that the way he always did. When you read one of Dad's books, you cringe at all the characters as foibles and feel uncomfortable and exposed. That is why his books aren't popular. Only people who are made happy enough by great art for it to outweigh the discomfort can enjoy them. Far from Despising you, he admired and wondered about you and considered you an authentic artist. He also considered your life luckier than his and your nature safer. Don't be sorry for coming to the funeral, Monica added in the margin. Sharon and I were happy to see you in spite of ourselves. We both agreed it was kind and admirable of you to have made a point of being there. Andre D. hosted another, somewhat smaller memorial service at Harvard's Lamont Library on February the 3rd, Yates's 67th birthday. Notably absent on both occasions was Yates's daughter Gina, in Arizona at the time. I knew it would be a literary event, she explained, and that whole side of Dad's life was separate from our relationship. 4 months after Yates's death, Sam Lawrence came to the painful conclusion that Uncertain Times wasn't complete enough to publish. There are, of course, wonderful things in it, and how we wish your father could have finished it and made it the novel he envisioned, he wrote Monica. But to publish it in its present state would serve neither the loyal Yates fans and readers nor his own memory. As you well know, your father was a perfectionist, and I doubt if he would have wanted this manuscript published or possibly even read in its unfinished state. Lawrence had decided not to pursue collection of the large unearned advance in deference to an author he loved and admired. 10 months later, just over a year after Yates's death, Lawrence himself died of a heart attack. Yates was not listed by the Times as one of the many important writers Lawrence had introduced to the public, though Richard Brautigan and J.P. Donlevy were. In his will, Yates left everything to his daughters in equal shares and named Monica as his executor. She would be executrix. He died deep in debt and remained so even after Lawrence forgave the advances. There was David Milch's walking around money, which perhaps bothered Yates's shade. I'll get him that goddamn 36 grand. If not Milch, but the federal government wasn't so easily appeased. Again and again, Monica was contacted about her father's unpaid income tax, until finally even the IRS realized that collection was hopeless. It was a big hole, said Monica, and we turned our backs on it all and felt bad. Yates's first wife, Sheila, however, inherited her mother's shrewdness about money and lives comfortably on her investments after retiring as a school teacher. Monica once mentioned to her father that Sheila had managed to save $100,000. Why doesn't she give you $1,000, baby? Said Yates. Then she'd have $99,000 fucking dollars saved. Eventually, Sheila came through in her own way. When Monica was engaged to a surgeon named Brian Shapiro in 1995, her mother paid for a modest wedding in Scarsdale. At the reception, Sharon asked Harvey Shapiro, no relation to Monica's husband, to go introduce himself to Sheila. Hi, he said, I'm Harvey Shapiro. I knew your husband. Sheila gave him a hard stare and walked away without a word. Sheila's brother Charlie is alive and spry. For the last decade or so, he's worked as a ward clerk at the last VA hospital where he was a patient. He's often floated from ward to ward, as he has a tendency to rearrange the nurses' station wherever he goes. They set it up to talk on the phone, he says emphatically, not to work. The only people he sees are family, and during holidays he hovers about the kitchen bouncing on the balls of his feet a la John Givings. Martha Spear moved to Hancock, Michigan after her second marriage ended in 1993. As for Monica, she went on to lead the sort of life that her father had always thought would be the most fulfilling for her. She is now a housewife and mother to 3 boys and a girl. As young women, both Sharon and Monica suffered a single isolated psychotic episode, never to recur. Gina's turn came in 1998. She and her husband had been traveling almost 5 months out of every year, and after a bout of dysentery in Southeast Asia, Gina began to experience a euphoric sense of omniscience. For a while, she thought she was a witch with psychic powers, and just before a long blackout, she fancied herself the goddess of the North Pole. Emergency room medics were on hand, so she thought at the time, to verify this. A little later, her father appeared to her, and Gina asked him what the secret to being a great writer was. Is that all you want to know? He smiled. As if to imply that there were more important things in life, said Gina. All right, if you really want to know, then I'll tell you. Very deliberately, he spoke the words. It's all in that last, final hesitation. But if you don't want to end up like me, you have to reverse it. Gina lay in bed, intoning over and over, reverse that final hesitation. When she related Yates's cryptic advice to her half-sister Monica, the latter burst out laughing. I was really hoping there'd be something in there we could use, she said. What are we supposed to do with that? Yates's ashes, still in their original shipping box, reside in the basement of Sharon's house in Brooklyn. She and Monica can't decide what to do with them. They've considered scattering them in Washington Square or, better still, over all of Manhattan from a plane. Their exasperated mother tells them to take the box down the street to Greenwood Cemetery, where no less than Peter Cooper and Lois Comfort Tiffany are buried. But Sharon's gotten used to having the ashes in her basement. Recently, when Yates finally got a story in the New Yorker, she gave the shipping box a little shake. Way to go, Dad! To write so well and then to be forgotten is a terrifying legacy, Stuart Onan wrote in his 1999 essay, The Lost World of Richard Yates. Onan went on to predict, however, eventually the books will make it back in print, just as Faulkner's and Fitzgerald's did. And Yates will take his place in the American canon. In the years after Yates's death, as his books dropped out of print and his reputation seemed headed for almost total oblivion, a number of devotees, mostly writers themselves, continued to press Yates's work on a new generation of readers. To preserve what Robin Metz called the tradition continuum from Flaubert to Fitzgerald to Yates, to enact a cultural literary secret handshake, as Richard Ford would have it. Yates's former students have felt the apostolic burden most keenly. DeWitt Henry calls Yates one of the few good voices in his head, and he tries to impart that voice to his own students. I hear his vigilant hectoring always, for genuine clarity, genuine feeling, the right word, the exact English sentence, the eloquent detail, the rigorous dramatization of story. Don't evade, don't cheat. Another student, Edwin Vaihe, remembers the loving way Yates found small truths in his students' stories. The descriptions of things like a hanger snapping when you jerked a coat from it. Many years later, Vaihe encountered Yates again and asked if his old teacher remembered him. Yes, of course, the latter replied. The snapping hanger. Richard Yates, said Vaihe, echoing Ford, echoing others, was the place you went back to. The resurrection of Richard Yates began in earnest with Random House's 2000 edition of Revolutionary Road, with an introduction by Ford that was also published in the New York Times Book Review. Ford described the novel as a cultish standard, especially among writers who have kept its reputation burnished by praising it, teaching it, sometimes unwittingly emulating its apparent effortlessness, its complete accessibility, its luminous particularity, its deep seriousness toward us human beings, about whom it conjures shocking insights and appraisals. This edition has continued to sell briskly, such that one might venture to hope that Revolutionary Road is now installed in the so-called canon, whatever that is. The novel was listed by the Harvard Bookstore as one of the 100 favorite titles among college students, and the Dalkey Archive Press named it one of their 30 most influential novels of the 20th century. When a new edition was published in the UK in 2001, Paul Connolly of the Times noted that finally the British reading public will be given the opportunity to discover America's finest forgotten author. Also that year, a banner year in what one is emboldened to call the Yates Revival, Holt published the collected stories of Richard Yates, which actually made bestseller lists in Washington, Boston, San Francisco, and elsewhere. New editions of The Easter Parade, A Good School, and A Special Providence have followed, and soon perhaps Yates's entire oeuvre will be back in print to stay. One imagines Yates pleased, if not particularly happy. Like his own characters, he couldn't help being who he was. If he'd lived to see his fame increase, no doubt he'd fret over his imperfections all the more, and resume the lonely struggle to do better, this crazy, obsessive business of trying to be a good writer. While he endured his non-writing life as best he could, which is to say, not very well. Henry James spoke of the obstinate finality of human being, said David Milch, And Dick was that. He wasn't an aching example of what an artist is and what being an artist doesn't solve in our human predicament. Perhaps, but imagine a Richard Yates to whom it never occurred to write a word, and there would be a picture of misery, rather than one of redemptive heroism. And happiness too, yes, that too, after a fashion. I remember how much you laughed, said Andre D. in memoriam, how easy it was to make you laugh, how much of your laughter was at yourself. It's your mornings, I imagine, Dick. You never complained to me about your body, so I imagine you waking to a room, a world that seemed to have enough air for everyone but you, and gathering yourself, putting on those gentleman's clothes you wore, and bringing your great heart and your pure writer's conscience to the desk, the legal pad, the pencil. You just kept doing it, morning after morning, and you inspired me. You gave me courage, taking your morning stand against your flesh and circumstance, writing your prose that was like a blade, a cloud, a flame, a breath. So you rest, old friend. I'll always love you. And about all those words you wrote in all your books on my shelf, I'll say as you used to about a book or story you loved. They're swell, Dick. They're really swell. It's a sweetheart of a life's work. It's a sweetheart.